Hello, I'm Papa Biceps. You're watching the Thorin YouTube channel, and remember, don't fuck with Papito.
Recently, I did a video which was talking about reasons people downplay Astralis' dominance or excuses they give for why they've succeeded and arguments against them actually being such a dominant or fabulous team. And one reason, which I essentially rephrased in different terminology, would in that video be the one about how, the other rosters just aren't quite good enough. Like, this player hasn't moved from this particular team to another, or this other lineup just hasn't gotten their shit together yet, or it's just a bad time in terms of contracts or whatever. But a better way to phrase this particular topic, and I thought I'd make it its own video, is the logic that Astralis is winning so much now, basically everything, because their competition isn't good enough. And what's the basis for saying that Astralis' competition isn't good enough? Well, because their opposition, the competition they have, doesn't win the titles at the tournament that Astralis is at. Astralis wins the vast majority of them, and they don't beat Astralis directly enough times. The problem with this scenario is this isn't just even particularly specific to Astralis, it's being used now. It's actually applied to pretty much all incredibly dominant players and teams in esports and in sports traditionally, actually. So similar scenario happened to Roger Federer in tennis. You had this era before what's now called the Big Four came along. So Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic, Andy Murray, who are the Big Four top-ranked players who've shared most of the Grand Slams over the last 20 years or so. Before Nadal, Djokovic and Murray came into their prime, Roger Federer was winning literally 3 Grand Slams a year and making the final of the other Grand Slam, and was incredibly good and was clear number one and was looking like the best player ever. But since Nadal came along and started beating him, in fact beating him most of the times, and started sharing some of the titles, and then later on Djokovic came along and became very dominant, and Murray had his own period where he was a good player and gradually rose up to being elite level. People look at the period before Nadal got really, really good on all the other surfaces aside from clay. So let's say 2008 and before, pre-2008 basically, and they say, that just wasn't that competitive. The reason why Federer won 3 out of the 4 Grand Slams is the other players just weren't as good. And then when you say, well, what do you mean just weren't as good? And then they said, well, where are their Grand Slams? And it's like, well, they can't have any Grand Slams, can they? Roger Federer won those ones. So similar thing happened in CSGO. In the early days, obviously people know NIP won their first 87 maps on LAN. They went 87-0. They finished top 4 at their first something like 27 LANs. Now, sure, that included some smaller LANs in the beginning of CSGO, and also included, for example, Swedish-only tournaments where even though actually the level of competition was good, it maybe wasn't as good as top international competition. But even so, all this early period, the reason why people say Fnatic's the greatest team ever, the reason why people wouldn't even consider NIP a real contrast to Astralis now or Fnatic is because people say, well, that Astralis, NIP just went undefeated, and so you have a lot of myths that rise up from that. So, for example, other people just weren't trying as well, or other people weren't paid enough money, or Nips practiced the game more. These are all actually nonsense excuses, and in fact, you can go and track them down. There's no basis to them. But these are excuses from people scrambling to find a reason as to why NIP's incredible dominance isn't actually as good. So then you can even look in a game like League of Legends, I saw this happen. So one of the only times a team's ever gone undefeated in the Korean League, which is the top league in the world, was in OGN Champions Winter 2013. This was an SK Telecom, Faker and Piglet, etc., and Goma, the coach, came back from Worlds. They actually lost in the World Cyber Games qualifier for that year, but they then went on and they won the next season of OGN Champions, which is the best competition in the world, the hardest in the world to win in theory. And they went undefeated. They went 15-0. And I actually heard someone, it was a Western commentator, I forget if it was Freak or if it was Corby or Jat. I'm not quite sure who it was. I believe it might have been Jat who alluded to it. He said something along the lines of that since SK Telecom had gone undefeated in OGN Champions, that suggested that the league wasn't as competitive or the competition wasn't as good, and yet he used the circular logic of the fact that they'd gone undefeated, showed that the competition couldn't be as good, because why didn't they lose at least one game? Now, the reason why this is irrational, and I know people are on the surface, as I explained it, going to be able to see the basics of why this is not really such a logical argument, is really well highlighted when I put it this way. If any of these people, Roger Federer, NIP, Astralis or SK Telecom, had simply lost a few more games along the way, the odd tournament more along the way, It would have made their opponent's record against them better. It would have made their opponents and the rest of the field's number of titles more. And therefore, this is the craziest part, it would then make the very same wins that all those individuals had, except in our world, reality, they had those wins and more wins. By having the exact same wins, but some extra losses, the losses, by this circular logic, would have increased the acclaim that the wins they then got over the teams they beat and the tournaments that they won were worth greater. So what's bizarre is, if I beat you, so in this particular case, we'll give an example like CSGO, because we've got a perfect one, right? If Astralis beats Team Liquid every single time, which they do, they've beaten them in every single series this year, then people say, see, Astralis is just on top because a team like Team Liquid's number 2 or number 3, you know, teams who don't win titles, teams who aren't as good. So bizarrely, if Astralis had just lost 2 of their titles to Team Liquid along the way, and everything else had stayed the same. Astralis still has many, many titles. The majority of the titles, has the major, has the most dominant year overall, still an incredibly good team. Because now Team Liquid would have won 2 events, because they played them in the final so many times, people would now say that their other wins over Team Liquid mean more, and therefore somehow they wouldn't have the same criticism of Astralis, and somehow they'd be a very dominant team, even though actually, by many metrics, they are less dominant in that particular scenario, which is kind of weird, right? I mean, you can see this in history, because who was the greatest team of all time? I haven't yet fully thought out whether Astralis beats them yet. I have my suspicions, but I'd have to weigh up all the factors. It's got to be Fnatic 2015, right? We all remember the lineup before Dennis came in, when they still had Pronax, when Olafmeister was the star player, when they had Crims and Flusher and JW. So this team, one of the reasons why ties into this as to why people think they're the most impressive of all time. It's not just the titles and the top 4s and the majors. A reason why as well is people think, right, well, they played in the most competitive era, right? I might even agree with it myself. I've said as much in many videos as along the way. But I think one of the reasons why is because it was such a stacked era in terms of tournaments and a lot of really great teams played then, it meant that when Fnatic beat out the Envious/LDLC team, who actually were never beating them on LAN, well, that team was top 4 all the time. That team was the other dominant team of the era. That team was winning majors. That team was winning big international tournaments. So then when Fnatic beat them all the time, that was fine. When Fnatic actually lost most of their series to TSM, Carrigan's Danish team that later on became Astralis, that was okay because TSM's winning tournaments and TSM wasn't the overall number 1 dominant team, and TSM lost, for example, to Envious and to some of the other teams. And so as long as Fnatic won against the overall field, that again made the era seem more competitive, made Fnatic's accomplishments seem greater. In fact, it meant that they could lose and then come back and win tournaments afterwards and seem even more powerful. When they lost to Virtus Pro, a very, very powerful team with a lot of history, a core that had won a major. Again, that also boosted Fnatic being amazing because Virtus could also lose to Virtus Pro, as they famously did at the ESL Invitational for Dubai in 2015. Then you had the second Envious when they got Kenny S and Apex in the roster shuffle, where they played them in the 2 majors. They won one of them in the ESL Cologne final, and then they lost one in the round of 8. Somehow, the fact that they could lose and win, and that these teams could also win titles, that made that more competitive. NIP was still around. Obviously, Veterans had a core that had a lot of history, had been the original dominant team, not with the exact 5-man lineup. They had McClelly and Alu this year, but we're talking about in the past when they used to have Fifth Lion in the team. So the bizarre thing about this is a team like Astralis is exactly in the bad spot where they're going to suffer the most from this, because they rarely lose maps. Never mind losing series and losing tournaments, things that happen very, very rarely. They rarely lose maps to opponents. They also beat literally every single one of the teams in the field that are top competition, that are considered real opposition to them. So the likes of FaZe Clan, the likes of Na'Vi, the likes of Team Liquid, the likes of Mouse, they beat these teams much more than those teams beat them. And it's still rare that those teams ever actually are able to beat Astralis. So as a result, Astralis being so dominant and so very good and not giving up anything and being so ruthless actually punishes them more. Now, what's interesting about this is I actually have a piece of information that comes from the science world, which might explain in your brain part of why this is the case. And I get it, because I kind of, when I don't think of the context, I can get lulled into thinking this way too. So I actually found this out from a Jordan Peterson talk. I forget which particular talk, but I know he's referenced it in his Maps of Meaning work and many of his lectures on YouTube. And it was research done by someone who was from Estonia called Jak Panskep. And what he discovered was that when you had young male rat, I believe they were male rats, young rats, it's usually male, right? And you had these rats in an environment in which they could play with each other. They were just all in the same cage or the same in confined area. What would happen was the rats would play with each other, much like young humans would play with each other, young boys, where they would roughhouse and they would wrestle with each other and they would like fight, but not fully seriously trying to kill each other, and a bit of give and take, etc. there. And what's interesting is the rats would fight irrelevant to how big their size was. So a very small rat might fight with a big rat, even though, you know, as an outsider, you go, well, you're going to lose that fight all day long. What's interesting is part of this was it's a play mechanism, and the rats are testing their limits and they're seeing what happens when they battle other people and people they've battled before, and people who are bigger than them and people who are smaller than them. Now, here's the interesting detail that I'm going to get here. If we imagine within this game, and this is something that the rats were doing, that the rats won if they were able to just pin the other mouse down. So it's kind of like traditional Greco-Roman wrestling. You win by pinning the opponent down, right? What was amazing was Jak Panskep found that if a bigger rat fought a little rat, and obviously because he's bigger, he's going to win most of the time, but he won more than 70% of the time. So the little rat was losing more than 30% of the time that he was actually he was not able to win at least 30%. Then what he found was the smaller rat would just stop taking part in the roughhousing. He wouldn't play anymore. He'd given up on it. He realized there was no point. So what's bizarre is by the bigger rat actually losing 30% of the time, so by losing a bunch, he gets to play more and he gets to win more overall matches by having more games against the small rat. So it's actually just a concept in our minds where we think it's unfair because someone's winning all the time. And we think if they're winning all the time, the other person must not be any good. Whereas what really defines how good a team is? Well, you've got to look at some factors like, yes, dominance in terms of numbers are good, but then you need the context, right? So I could give you a lot of great context as to why NIP wasn't good. I actually did already when I talked about playing the smaller tournaments, playing teams only from Sweden. Those are good reasons to explain why some of their wins and numbers aren't as good as Astralis' numbers that might be in a similar scale. But when you look at factors like, does the fact that Fnatic beat teams that won other titles make their era more competitive, or Fnatic a better team for then winning in that era than Astralis in this particular era? Like, I can make a strong case that a team like FaZe, a team like Na'Vi are perhaps as good as the likes of Envious or TSM from those years in their own different ways. You can make these cases. So you can go with context. You can go with the historical numbers, the stats, the metrics. You can go with the eye test. Does the eye test say who's more dominant, or if the other teams aren't quite as good? Going with just saying, well, these teams didn't win titles, as I hope this video explains, is kind of circular logic. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And just think of it that way. So if Astralis had lost one or two finals to Team Liquid won some big titles as a result, and then still lost to Astralis, would that make Astralis more dominant now because it would somehow make their era more competitive? No, it's better for them to win all the matches, right? That makes them the most dominant team ever. This argument doesn't really make a lot of sense. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas, Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, James Harding, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for some of my content? Do you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Perhaps you'd like teasers for some of my upcoming content, find out who the guests are, what the topics are. Maybe you want to take part in an esports discussion with me. Well, if you want any of the above or aforementioned rewards and exclusives, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the description box below.